Hello everyone, I have some exciting news for you. Today you are going to expand even further your vocabulary of chords. I am going to introduce you today to a group of chords, the so-called predominant harmonies. Let's go ahead and get started. Let's listen to the following example by Franz Schubert. And let's start by analyzing it just very briefly. Schubert, we are in the key of E flat major, right? And Schubert starts with the tonic in the first measure. Tonic in E flat major, chord 1. And then he expands that tonic through 5, 4, 3 in the second measure, only to go back to the tonic in the first inversion in the third measure. So he starts by the tonic expansion, chord 1, then 5, 4, 3, and then 1, 6. Then in the fourth measure, we have chord 5, 6, the first inversion dominant chord, and he resolves it onto the tonic again in the fifth measure. And listen again to this progression of chords: 1, 4, 5, 4, 3, 1, 6, 5, 6, and 1. And he could go like that over and over again, infinitely. So what he now needs is a more concluding set of chords so that we know that this musical sentence is coming to an end. And this is what he is doing. Notice that in measure 7, he has a root position, dominant 7th, and then in the following measure, he resolves that onto the root position tonic, which sounds much more concluding than the first 4 or 5 measures. But Schubert does not simply go 1 in measure 5 and then 5, 7 and 1 again. He inserts another chord right before the dominant. So instead of 1, 5, 7, 1, he writes 1, 2, 6, chord 2 in first inversion, and only then the dominant in 5, 7, and 1. So let me play again for you measures 5, 6, 7, and 8. That chord 2, 6 is an example of a chord that leads onto the dominant. Because it connects the initial 1 and 5 of the basic 1-5-1 progression, we call such a chord predominant harmony. So chord 2-6 is a predominant harmony. The most important chords that function as predominants are chord 2, 2-6 that we just saw in the Schubert example, and chord 4. So that means that in our musical grammar, the most focused chord progression with a strong sense of direction is going to be 1, 4, 5, 1. Or 1, 2, 5, 1, or 1, 2, 6, 5, 1. And it is important to always place that predominant harmony before the dominant, not after. Predominant, so that chord comes pre-chord 5, before chord 5. Okay, so now let's move on to a rule of thumb that I would like you to keep at the back of your mind during today's lesson. And this rule is going to be applicable to whenever you are dealing with the progression from chord 1 to chord 2, or from chord 4 to chord 5. Why are these particular cases challenging? Because the roots of these chords are a second apart from each other. So this is the rule that I would like you to follow. When the roots of two chords are a second apart, start by trying to move all upper voices in contrary motion with the bass. And remember that this is just a rule of thumb. It is not law that we should always follow. That rule is going to keep you far away from the danger of falling into the illegal parallels, but we might sometimes find ourselves in situations in which we would have to depart slightly from that rule. But nevertheless, it will be useful for you to keep that rule at the back of your mind whenever you are dealing with chords that are a second apart from each other. For example, when you're going from chord 1 to chord 2, or from chord 4 to 5. When you are in these situations, start by moving all upper voices in contrary motion with the bass. Okay, so if we've got our rule of thumb already at the back of our minds, let's move on to looking at each of these predominant chords separately. First, chord 2. It is made of the 2nd, 4th, and 6th degree of the scale. When going from chord 1 to 2, the roots of these two chords are a second apart. So this is the perfect opportunity for you to apply that rule of thumb that you just learned, moving the upper voices in the contrary motion with the bass. We can also have an example in which we are moving from 1/6 to chord 2. Take a look at this one. Now let's take a look at chord 2/6. It is made of the 4th, the 6th, and the 2nd degrees of the scale. This would be chord 2, and this is 2/6. We're going to see what function that chord 2/6 can play a little bit later on, but for now let's move straight away onto the last predominant chord for today, which is chord 4. Chord 4 is made of the 4th, 6th, and 1st degrees of the scale. Pay attention to how much in common chord 2/6 and chord 4 have. This is chord 4. This is 2/6. It is enough to change just one note. It is enough to change just one note in chord 4 to suddenly find ourselves in chord 2. This is how you could move from chord 4 to chord 2, then again 2 in root position, then the dominant, and then the tonic. But let's not go into too much detail on these chords. Let's instead look at examples of cadences that make use of these predominant harmonies. And once again, chord 1, chord 4, chord 5, and chord 1 at the end. Now let's take a look at a similar example. This time, instead of chord 4, we're going to have chord 2. And now, instead of chord 2, we're going to have chord 2, 6. We could also start on the tonic in the first inversion. This was 1, 6, 4, and 5. And now we could have the tonic in the first inversion, then chord 2, 6. As you can see, there are various bass line shapes that like to make use of these predominant chords, 2, 2, 6, or chord 4. The most important advantage that we gain from using these chords is being able to move step by step in the bass, all the way from the first to the 5th degree of the scale. In other words, chords 2, 2, 6, and 4 allow us to have a stepwise bass line. So let's take a look at the following example. We are in the key of E flat major. And we would like our bass to go stepwise from the first all the way to the 5th degree of the scale. And this is how we could harmonize this stepwise bass line. We could start with the tonic expansion, chord 1 through 5, 4, 3 to 1, 6. Tonic expansion that you already know very well. Then we could go on to chord 2, 6 to have that 4th degree of the scale in the bass. And then after that predominant chord, we of course have to have the dominant, in this case 5, 7 chord, and then the resolution to the tonic. And this is another example of that same chord harmonization, this time in the key of B flat major. Again, we want our bass to move stepwise from the 1st to the 5th degree of the scale. We start with the tonic expansion. Then the predominant chord 4, from which we can move on to the dominant 7th and resolve it onto 1. There is also another way for us to harmonize a stepwise bass line. Instead of expanding chord 1, we can expand that predominant chord 2. Let's take a look at an example of how that would work. So we are in the key of F major, and we we are starting on the tonic. And then we want our bass, of course, to go up from the 1st to the 5th degree of the scale. So we start on the tonic, and then for the following 3 bass notes, we're going to have chord 2, chord 1, 6, and then 2, 6. So what happened with these 3 chords is that we have here the expansion of chord 2. Chord 2 in root position, going on to chord 2 in the 1st inversion, with that tonic in the 1st inversion in between. Chord 2, tonic in the 1st inversion in between, only to go on to chord 2, 6. And after that, we can have our dominant, and finally resolve it onto 1. Let's take a look at another example of how to do that. Let's say we are in the key of D major, and we start on the tonic. Then on the 2nd degree of the scale in the bass, we are going to move on to chord 2. And we're going to expand it by going from chord 2 via 1, 6, all the way to chord 2, 6. Then we can have our dominant 7th chord and the resolution onto the final tonic. Okay, so we have seen how to harmonize a stepwise bass line from the 1st to the 5th degree of the scale. But what about some soprano shapes? Well, at the beginning or in the middle of a phrase, we might encounter a melodic line in the soprano ascending from the 5th to the 8th degree of the scale. And we could harmonize it as 1, 4, 5, and 1. Let me play that example for you. Let's say we are in the key of B flat major, so we want to have this soprano line 5, 6, 7, and 8th degree of the scale. And if we harmonize it as 1, 4, 5, 1, this is how it sounds. But as you can see, it is incredibly easy to fall into the trap of parallel fifths and octaves while going from chord 4 onto chord 5. Because these two chords, chord 4 and chord 5, are just a second apart from each other. And that is why there is going to be a much better way, a much more convenient and safer way to harmonize this stepwise soprano. And it's going to be 1, 4, then 5, 4, 3, and back to chord 1. So instead of 1, 4, 5, 1, we're going to have 1, 4, 5, 4, 3, and 1. And with in this way, we can still keep our beautiful stepwise soprano. And the soprano line would be perfect for the very beginning of a piece of music or somewhere in the middle of it. It is not good for the very end. Now let's move on to the topic of the dominant 7th chord, which we have talked about a lot already. Chords 4, 2, and 2, 6 all lead very easily into 5, 7, into the dominant 7th, because all of these predominant chords contain the 4th degree of the scale. Chord 4, this is the 4th degree of the scale. Chord 2, this is the 4th degree of the scale. And chord 2/6 also contains the 4th degree of the scale. So if we go from one of those chords onto 5/7, at the change of harmony, this tone, the 4th degree of the scale, it becomes the 7th of the dominant 7th chord. And if we keep the 4th degree in the same voice, first as a consonance and then as the dissonant 7th of the 5/7 chord, the dissonance is said to be prepared. So if you keep that common tone in the same voice, you will have prepared the dissonance. And preparing that dissonance allows it to enter in a smooth manner, and it is generally a very good thing to prepare the dissonance. And all of this might sound a little bit complicated, but trust me, it is much easier in practice. Take a look at this example. We have a simple progression of chords, the tonic, chord 2/6 as the predominant, then 5/7 as the dominant, and resolution onto the final tonic. And take a look at what happens with the 4th degree of the scale in the chords 2/6 and 5/7. The 4th degree of the scale remained in the same voice, in this case in the alto, and it changed from being a consonant tone in the 2/6 chord. It changed into becoming a 7th, the dissonance of the 5/7 chord. Then it resolves onto 1. And now take a look at another example. Again, we have chord 1, then we have the predominant 4, and here our 4th degree of the scale is in the bass and in the tenor. And then we move on to 5/7, and that 4th degree of the scale remains in the tenor. It becomes the 7th of the dominant 7th chord, and then it resolves onto the tonic. Whenever you are moving from a predominant chord onto the dominant 7th, remember to prepare the 7th, to prepare the dissonance. That is to keep the 4th degree of the scale in the same voice as a common tone. Now, the last thing that we have to talk about is the predominant harmony in minor keys. And minor keys are a particular case here, because in minor keys there are 2 chords really that work especially well for predominant harmony, chord 2/6 and chord 4. Notice that chord 2 in minor is not that frequently used. So let's focus on just these 2, chord 2/6 and chord 4. And let me play those 2 for you in a minor key. This is 2/6. It is a diminished chord. And chord 4. 2/6 and 4. And here's the thing, if you lead from chord 2/6 or chord 4, which both include the 6th degree of the minor scale, if you lead from them onto chord 5, which includes the sharp 7th degree of the scale, you will end up having a leap of an augmented second in one of your voices, because that augmented second, is going to be between the 6th and the sharp 7th degree of the scale. And as you remember, augmented seconds are extremely difficult to sing. So if we ask our singer in the choir to sing that horrific interval of the augmented second, we would destroy their days. And we should avoid making one of those voices to sing that terrible interval. But how do we avoid it? So here's the rule. In minor keys, when the predominant chord goes to chord 5, you should approach the 7th degree of the scale from above, not from below. Take a look at this example. I start on tonic in minor. Then I need chord 2-6. So I move to it, and I move all my upper voices in the contrary motion with the bass. And then I want my soprano to sing the sharp 7th degree. So that my sharp 7th degree is approached from above and not from below. So again, 2-6 with a B in the soprano, and chord 5 with a G sharp in the soprano. If I had this, chord 2-6, and then I remained on that B natural in my soprano, and instead I asked my alto to sing the sharp 7th degree, my alto would have jumped from F to G sharp, which would be the leap of the augmented second. So in order to avoid that, remember about this rule. When you are in a minor key, and if you're going from the predominant harmony onto the dominant chord, always approach the leading tone, the 7th degree of the scale, from above. And another rule that you should remember about for these particular cases in the minor key is to never double the 6th degree of the scale in your predominant chord. If you remember about these two rules, you are going to be safe and you're not going to fall into the trap of the illegal parallel intervals or into the trap of making one of your voices sing that uncomfortable interval of the augmented second. Congratulations! This is it for today's lesson about the predominant chords. You have seen a variety of ways in which we could use the predominant chords, and that variety could be a little bit overwhelming. Remember that our goal is for you to play around with these chords and to experiment for yourself what the ways are of using these chords to make your own chord progressions. And remember that as long as you use the predominant chords before the dominant, you're fine. Congratulations, and don't forget to move on to the next parts of the lesson.